Today is September 13th, 2019, and thank you so much for meeting with me here in Gander.
My pleasure.
Can you please introduce yourself?
My name is Leslie Arden. I'm a composer lyricist, sometimes book writer, sometimes music director, mostly composer lyricist.
So you studied physics and genetics.
Yeah, my parents were in the business and they said, whatever you do, don't try to make a living being any kind of an artist. So I was good in science and math, so I went to Guelph University for physics and genetics, and then at the end of my first year, I went and talked to the guidance counselor and asked what the job prospects were for theoretical geneticists and physicists, and he said, oh, there aren't any. It's a really lean field. And I thought, well, I might as well be in music if I'm going to be working hard at something. So I switched back to music, and I've never looked back.
So I read that as a kid you watched how musicals were developed at the Charlatan Festival.
Yeah, my mom was in the, you've done her research. My mom was in the Charlatan Festival for years, and so in the summer I would spend, when I was a kid, I would spend my summers there. That was back at the Alan Lund years, when they, when Anne of Green Gables was first starting out, and they developed, they usually developed a new musical every year. So they had, back in the old days, they would have 3 main stage musicals. One was probably a repeat of whatever the new musical was the year before, and then there was Anne of Green Gables, and then a new one. So every year I got to watch them put a new musical together, see what worked, what didn't.
How did it inform your writing later on?
Oh, hugely, and not just because of watching the rehearsals, but also I had at my disposal many fabulous artists if I had any questions. For instance, I remember sitting down with John Fenwick, who was the orchestrator and sometime composer. He wrote, I think he did the music to Johnny Belinda, but he was brilliant orchestrator, and I remember he invited me over for dinner one night when I was a little kid and talked to me about orchestration and played examples, and I hear his voice in my ear when I'm orchestrating to this day. Fen Watkin, I remember being a little kid and walking up to Fen Watkin, who was the music director there at the Charlatan Festival, and saying, how do you write drum parts? And he sat me down at his kitchen table and showed me how to write drum parts. And I got to watch the greatest musical theater talent in the country, rehearsing and performing all the time.
Oh, that must have been great.
Oh my gosh, yes. It was, well, and Prince Edward Island is not a bad place to have to spend a summer. It was gorgeous. It was a heavenly childhood experience.
And what was the transition like from being only a composer and to being lyricist as well?
Yeah, that happened by accident. All I wanted to do was be a serious composer. I thought maybe I wanted to be a film composer. And a bunch of friends were taking the Lehman Engel workshop, which became the BMI workshop in New York and Los Angeles, and I attended the one in Toronto. And I was just a composer, had no interest in writing words, and I joined the class, and he said, oh, there's an odd number of students in the class and everybody else is already paired up, so write your own lyrics for now, and as soon as a lyricist comes available, you can collaborate. So I started writing lyrics, and the rest is history. Yeah.
I really loved what you said about how content dictates form.
Mm-hmm.
And like you made 2 points, like you mentioned that musicals like Hamilton and Come From Away, it's not perfect rhymes because Come From Away, well, it's kind of folk style, and Hamilton hip hop and rap. Mm-hmm. And you also mentioned that sometimes if character is less sophisticated, or like if he's very angry or something, like he probably won't use perfect rhymes.
Well, what I would do is not have the character rhyme at all. I prefer to rhyme perfectly all the time. It's just, that's how I write. That's how I learned to write, and I still do it. I think that the lyric lands cleaner, better. I think Sondheim said something like, when a perfect rhyme lands, it goes ping, and when an imperfect rhyme or a false rhyme or assonance lands, it lands like a wet dishcloth, I think he said. And it's true, it goes ping if it's a perfect rhyme. So if I had an unsophisticated character, or a character who was very emotional, angry, passionate, I would probably not have them rhyme at all. But what I wouldn't do is use false rhymes.
And what's the difference between I guess, poetry and song lyrics in musical theater?
Song lyrics should sound, well, I believe they should sound like a continuation of the dialogue, and they should sound like it should be just the person speaking. It happens to be musicalized. It just happens to have certain pitches, but it's just musicalized dialogue. Poetry is something different. You're looking for lots of metaphors and similes and flowery speech and different ways of saying things, and you often use words for which you need to run off to the dictionary to find out what they mean. You don't want that in a musical. For one thing, you want to move the story forward and develop the characters, so you don't want the audience to sit there and go, I don't know what that word means, unless that's the point, unless it's an English professor who always uses words that nobody understands, then yes. But if it's just a person like you or me, it should sound like a person like you or me. It should sound like this person's just talking.
I talked to one lyricist recently, and he said that he prefers to use new rhymes because what he cares about is how it's sung, like not, like even if it's not perfect rhyme, sometimes the way actors sing it, it sounds like right for him in this context.
Well, I'm not as stringent as some people think about the perfect rhymes. If it's pronounced in a similar way, even if it's a D instead of a T. In fact, I think they rhyme greatest with sadist. Now, a stickler would say, well, that's not a perfect rhyme. But when we say, we don't say greatest. We say, oh, he's the greatest. It's almost a D. So you could say sadist rhymes with greatest. And that's fine by me. What I won't do is rhyme a B with something like that. And yeah, there are a lot of people that... my favorite lyricist is Joni Mitchell. She doesn't rhyme perfectly anywhere, but that's pop music. It's not musical theater. There are a lot of pop songwriters that have tried to write musicals. They're almost always failures. It's just taste.
If someone is just starting out, would you recommend reading the book of famous musicals, going over all the lyrics and analyzing it, or how do you learn how to do it well?
I think I learned to write lyrics from just sitting with, this is going to date me, sitting with the Stephen Sondheim musicals and reading along with I had records like Sweeney Todd, that was like 1978 or 9 or something, and just reading the libretto while I'm listening to the musical and just looking at all those internal rhymes and how he comes in the back door, how he, the metaphors he uses, how specific his lyrics are, and of course the music, how brilliant the music is. So yeah, I just sit and listen and listen and listen, but really you learn to write by writing. You can go to as many classes and listen to as much as you want, but you learn to write by writing. You learn to write by writing and having your work produced, because if you never see it up on a stage, you don't know what works and what doesn't work.
You mentioned that when you talked about the Starlight Horse, that director had this design idea and really informed your writing. I was wondering, how often does it happen that you talk to the director or designer, like lighting designer, and because of their feedback you start writing something entirely differently?
Often. It often happens. What varies widely is when the director becomes involved in the project. For instance, I'm writing a show for Queen's University. There's no director attached yet, so I'm not getting any feedback from any kind of a dramaturge or a director. I'm writing a show for the Grand Theatre, and it's the director who commissioned it. So he was involved from the get-go. So, I mean, our first discussion was, he said, I already have design ideas. That was our first meeting. So that's going to inform my writing right from the very first moment I begin to research the project. Most of the time that doesn't happen. Most of the time, even if a theater commissions a project, there's not a director on board for a little while. And then if there is, sometimes that's not the director that goes on to direct it. Like whoever first directed Come From Away was not the Broadway director. So. And
what's the role of dramaturg? What exactly do they do?
Again, that varies from situation to situation. I've worked with a few, and they're usually there to, they often research the historical context of the piece, so they bring the who, what, when, where's, all that. They have all that in mind, and they come with all that information. And the other thing they do is they take a look at your piece and they suggest edits and cuts and clarity, and it's no matter who you are and how much experience you've had and how learned you may be, you cannot see the forest for the trees eventually. Yeah, and you become attached to certain songs and certain scenes and certain ideas and certain characters, and sometimes it just takes a strong dramaturge to go, you know what, you don't even need these 3 scenes. We don't move anywhere fast enough, and it's not clear enough, and we don't even need that character. You can take him right out of the show. And that's really hard, because a writer will often fight to hang on to that song or that character or that scene or whatever, and you need that outside eye to say, you know what, you can just cut to the chase.
And how early in the process are they attached to the project? Like,
again, varies widely. If you have a director in place, often you don't need a dramaturge. The director will act as the dramaturge, or dramaturg, however. If sometimes a theater will commission a piece, and the theater has a resident dramaturge, and they're attached right away. I worked a lot with Iris Turcotte at Can Stage and other places, and she was a huge help, and I loved working with her.
She worked with Robert Sheff as well, didn't she?
Yeah. Yeah. And she knew all those people.
Yeah, he told me how much he misses her.
Oh my gosh, yes. Yeah. She was pretty fantastic. And we had a wonderful relationship in that she would give me lots of ideas and tell me lots of stuff that I should do with the show. And she was fine with me taking and leaving what I chose. So I have to admit, I probably took 80% of what she suggested. And there were some things she suggested, and to this day, I regret that I did not take that advice, because after weeks or months have gone by, I'm able to look at it and go, oh my God, she was right. So yeah, she was brilliant. So I worked with her a lot, and she would give me lots of ideas, and I'd take the ones that worked for me and leave the others.
And does he work more closely with librettist or lyricist composers as well? I was wondering, because
the dramaturge works more closely with the lyricist and the librettist. Well, the librettist is the lyricist, with the book writer and the lyricist. I don't think I've ever had a dramaturge that's had anything to say about the music.
Oh, really?
Yeah, usually that's the music director who might make some comments, although they don't make a lot of comments. The orchestrator might make some comments.
Maybe arranger? Or you do it yourself?
Yeah, I do my own arrangements. Yeah, I don't get a lot of musical feedback.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Let's talk about great songs that are just not bad, but wrong in the context.
Oh, sure.
I read that you mentioned in one of the interviews, like Martin's window in the House of Martin Guerre.
Yeah. Yeah. I wrote a song for Martin in the House of Martin Guerre. It was the second song in the show, and it was an I Want song for Martin, explaining why he hated living in Ardegat and why he wanted to run away. It was completely wrong, but it was a wonderful song. But it was wrong because it told the audience that Martin was our main character and we were going to follow his story. But we didn't. The main character was Bertrand, his wife. And he disappears in the next scene and doesn't show up again until the last scene. So we're misinforming the audience. And so I cut that song after I saw the show up on its feet once and realized what a mistake I'd made. Cut the song and replaced it with another song, which is now the best. I think it's the best song in the show. And it completely fixed the show. Because right from the get-go, you go, I know whose story it is. I know what story you're telling, and who I'm following through this whole show.
How do you? I guess people get so attached to songs, and because it's so specific, you can't really use it anywhere else. How do you find the power, I guess, to let it go?
I don't have that much trouble cutting. I don't know whether it's because I have a short memory. I mean, if I wrote a song today, then if you asked me to cut it tomorrow, I might have trouble. But if you asked me in a month, I would cut it. I could cut it because I've forgotten why I was so passionate about it. I've forgotten what the first impulse was. I've moved on to another song. And there is nothing worse than sitting in the audience and watching the audience's heads nod off because your show's too long, or this song sounds too much like the previous one, or it's just there's a lull in the pacing, or there's nothing worse than realizing you're boring your audience. I don't think I've ever made a cut that hasn't made the show so much stronger. Cutting is so good. So I always overwrite. In fact, one of my collaborators always teases me, and when I first go to play a new song for her, she says, Are you going to tell me now which one is the extra verse that will be cut, or are you going to tell me after you play the song? So she knows I've got one verse too many, or two verses too many, and in a show I've usually got 5 songs too many. But I get all the ideas out, and then I take out the pruning shears.
Do you keep these songs that were deleted?
Sometimes. Not always. Sometimes it's just not my strongest work, so I don't want it out there. Yeah.
Yeah, I was very curious about it because when I interviewed Michael Rubinoff, he showed me the song Washington from the demo recording of Come From Away. And it was the first time I didn't even know that these songs existed, and I loved it so much. I was wondering like how often do you cut songs, you know? I didn't really think about it.
All the time. I don't think I've ever written a show where a song hasn't been cut or rewritten. Again, because I purposefully overwrite. I think there's probably more on my cutting room floor than is still in the House of Martin Guerre. I just cut so much. And it's funny, sometimes they're hard to cut, but not because I'm in love with them, but because the performer is in love with them, or the director is in love. The first production, I realized before the show opened that Martin's song was wrong. And I went to the director and said, that's wrong, we've got to cut that song. And he wouldn't let me cut it because the person who sang the song, it was Stephen Sutcliffe singing the song, and he knocked it out of the park. He was brilliant. So he wouldn't let me cut the song. It was completely wrong for the show. But he did such an amazing job of the song. And then there's another song, I'm not going to say which one, there's another song I do not like in the House of Martin Guerre, but it brings down the house, and no one will let me cut it. And I would like it to be gone, but it's still there.
I was wondering about the research. You mentioned earlier that in the 16th century in France, girls get married in red, not white. Yeah. So when you wrote about Mama wants red and she wants blue,
Well, I was really lucky when I was writing The House of Martin Guerre in that I had an historical consultant, Natalie Zeman Davis, who wrote the book The Return of Martin Guerre, and she was also the historical consultant on the Gerard Depardieu film. Her husband was the head of the math department or something at U of T, and she was the head of the history department at Princeton, but she was every weekend she came up to Toronto. So she was my historical consultant, and she was a wealth of information. She's an expert on 16th century peasant life in France, as well as many other things. So I could just call her up and say, how would they say this? And for the wedding ceremony, what would be the wording of the wedding? What exactly would the priest say? And so that she would just say, the bride would be wearing red, and the priest would say these words, and blah, 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 blah. This would be measured in that. The way into the prison would be this, and the legalities, because there's a court scene in the second act. So she would fill me in on the legalities of how things would happen in the court. Hugely helpful and wonderful woman.
How do you find a historical consultant?
I was commissioned by Theatre Plus Toronto to first write The House of Martin Guerre, and there was the general manager or something like that, the right-hand man to the artistic director, Kelly Robinson, who went on to work with the Mirvishes and is a director. He directs a lot of opera. He knew Natalie Zeman Davis because he had worked with her on another project or something, and so he suggested the idea to me of the show, and he suggested Natalie Zeman Davis.
You mentioned that you love high stakes in musical theater.
Yeah.
I was wondering, when you're just starting writing the very first draft, do you think about stakes first, or
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean you think of the rising action, and what is the climax of the piece going to... What does the character... First of all, who's my main character? Whose story am I telling? What do they want? What is the obstacle? And what is the climax? What is the big crunch 2/3 of the way through Act 2. So yes, and I always work with a synopsis, mainly because I'm almost always, if not always, working with collaborators. So you all want to make sure you're writing the same show. Not all playwrights work with a synopsis, but they're usually writing the play all by themselves, and so they know what they're writing, or they don't. But when you're collaborating with up to 2 other people, you want to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So yeah, the first thing I do the broad strokes first. What's my theme? What am I exploring? What does my character want?
Do you create a book for your characters, or like use Pinterest or something? You know, some people keep like images like that remind them of certain characters or landscape.
Well, when I was writing the House of Martin Guerre, I looked at a lot of Bruegel paintings, and I had them up all over my walls. I had music from the 16th century playing all the time. Right now I'm writing a show that has a lot of First Nations elements. I have First Nations artwork all over my walls, and I have First Nations music playing all the time. Of course, these days you can just turn on CBC. There's so much programming, which is fantastic. But yeah, I listen to that all the time, and it's just in the background all the time. It's just constantly there, and I've just accumulated a huge library of all sorts of First Nations music and songs, and I just play it and play it and play it and play it and play it, and then that will inform what I write. But I won't be writing First Nations music. It'll be musical theater influenced by. And of course with the First Nations you have to be very careful of protocol and cultural appropriation and all those things. It's sticky, so you have to be very careful. Not so careful with 16th century France.
When did you first hear about Starlight Tours in Saskatchewan?
That was, well, I read about it in the paper back when it was going on, but no, it was Dennis Garnham, the artistic director of the Grand Theatre in London, Ontario. He read about it while he was the artistic director at Theatre Calgary. I think he was there when he read about it, and he thought I would love to tell this story. This is an important story. And we did a thing together years ago, and we just always wanted to work together again. And so when he became the artistic director in London, and I live in Ontario, he thought of me, and so we found a First Nations book writer and got to work on it.
How do you find the courage? Well, I guess it can be a very sensitive topic.
Yeah.
And like, how do you, I don't know, like fear can make you like censor yourself. I guess, how do you find the courage to do what feels right despite the, you know?
That's a good question. We're writing a fictional story. The book writer and I went to Saskatchewan, and we talked to many people. First Nations, white, everybody we could talk to, anybody. And we just gathered as much information as we could. And then we've come up with a story that is not about those particular people. It's a fictional story, but it's based on this situation. So it's a fictional town, fictional characters, but the characters are amalgamations of the people that we met. But nobody is truly that one person.
Do you talk to people often before you start writing the musical?
I do tons of research before I start writing. Yeah, sometimes people say, well, how do you deal with writer's block? When you've done tons and tons and tons of research, you have a lot from which to draw. You can always go back to your research. And if you're adapting a book or a play, go back to the play or the book. Read it again. Yeah.
What would you recommend? Like, what's your method of researching? Like, if someone is just like aspiring lyricist, I guess. Like, how is it properly done?
I don't know if I have a method. I think my method is just going down the rabbit hole. Because especially on the web now, because everything just leads you to something else. So you just start to research. For instance, I'm writing a show for Queen's University, and somebody told me about this idea, a historical thing, and I thought, oh, I'll write about that. So I started researching that, and I discovered a historical character that's involved in that story, but it's not that story. And I'm fascinated by this other character, so that's what the show's going to be. It's not going to be that first thing. So that often happens. For instance, when I started researching the House of Martin Guerre, I thought, oh, I'll make it about the Reformation, and it'll be about Martin and the imposter. And then I did all this research, and I thought, oh, no, it's not. It's about the wife. And it's not going to be about the Reformation. The Reformation will be the political and backdrop, the societal backdrop of what's going on, but I'm not going to be exploring that. Because there was something else that I discovered that I wanted to explore instead. So I think the important thing is not to be too locked into anything before you start to research. Just be open to anything that comes your way, and then just go down that rabbit hole.
How do you find your voice? You know, either musically or when you write lyrics, everyone has their own voice, their own style, I guess. Like,
what I love about musical theater is that I can try and submerge my voice a little bit, because each show is a different character in a different situation, different time period, sometimes different country. So if it's a contemporary person living on the streets today, it's probably going to be pop rock influenced. 16th century is going to be 16th century French music influenced. First, a story about First Nations, going to be influenced by powwow music and First Nations music, and so that's what I love about musical theater. And then the situation in the scene informs the style of the song. So if the person's angry and blasting someone, then it's going to be that style. So I've written stuff that sounds. I wrote a show that took place in 1945 when the boys were coming back from the Second World War, filled with swing and bebop, and because that was the style of the time. It's still Leslie Arden music, but heavily influenced by that.
I noticed that many people have recurrent themes in their work, and I was wondering, how do you express yourself without repeating yourself? Because,
I see.
Like, you know, sometimes it's like premise or just a concept, you know.
Yeah. Well, that's a tough question. That's a really good question. Maybe I do repeat myself. I mean, there are certain themes that do reappear in my work. Wow, that's a really good question. I've never thought about that. Well, again, what I try to do is pick shows that are nothing like anything else that I've written before. I remember, as Stephen Sondheim said to us, that after he wrote, I can't remember which show it was now, but I think, like, every time he finished writing a show, he would get all sorts of directors and producers and artistic directors saying, oh, you know, write this show for me, and it would be very close to this last show that he'd just written, and he would say no. So, I mean, if you look at the shows that he's written, like Company, and then is nothing like Sweeney Todd, is nothing like Merrily We Roll Along, is nothing like Pacific Overtures, is nothing like Follies, is nothing like... So he purposefully tries to pick shows that are nothing like anything else that he's written, and I've tried to do that too. And when I was studying with Sondheim, when the last day when we were all saying goodbye, he asked me what my next show was going to be, and I told him what I thought it was going to be, and he said, no, don't write it, it's too close to your last one. So I didn't write it, and I wrote something completely different. And I think that's really important, because we all, when I was young, when I was in my 20s, I was drawn to dark modal music. And dark modal themes, if you can have a theme. And I just naturally strayed into those colors and that style. And it was so important for me to, okay, then I'm going to write something that's filled with swing and bebop. Because otherwise I'm just going to be writing these folky, poppy, modal, sad pieces forever. So I think it's really, really important.
You know, it reminds me of that question that the Sheridan student asked, I really liked, about consistent musical style for a show. You know, he asked you, how do you choose a consistent musical style for a show?
Right, that was such a great question. For the score of a show, how do you come up with a style that is cohesive? So you have a cohesive score. That's very difficult, because you want to have pacing in the show. You don't want every song to sound like every other song, but you don't want every song to sound like they come from different shows. So yes.
It was such a thought-provoking question. I really liked it.
Yeah, it is very, 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 very good question. But again, I think that if you listen to enough music from that era, period, location, whatever, that will infuse everything, and you'll get a score that has some sort of cohesion. I'm hoping. Yeah.
When you talked about active songs and avoiding soliloquies, I kept thinking about Les Mis, because like most of the famous songs are like on my own, stars, who am I,
Yep.
dream the dream.
Well, that's why Les Mis is not my favorite show. I mean, it has a brilliant story, and it's passionate, and it has high stakes, and there are so many things that are wonderful. I could do with fewer soliloquy songs where they stand there and sing their feelings to me. I could do with fewer of them. My favorite parts of Les Mis are not actually the big blockbuster songs. I just love when they're singing to each other. I love that theme. I've seen your face before. Da 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 da. And that's another thing. They keep bringing back the same motifs. There are some brilliant things about their writing. They establish motifs and then they develop them and bring them back, which provides that cohesion that we were talking about. So it's Emily Dickinson would have said it's something that you can hang your hat on all through the show. Oh yeah, that's familiar. That's reprises are so important in a show.
What I love the most about Les Mis is the parallel between Javert and Valjean.
Yeah.
Because their transformation were caused by an act of compassion, like both of them.
Yeah.
It was interesting to see,
Yep.
how the character evolves, I guess.
Well, that's Hugo.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I knew the story before I went in because I'd read the novel. It's a brilliant book. It's I think. Yeah, I met Schoenberg and Boublil when I was in England studying with Sondheim, and Schoenberg was really, really interesting. Some of the students were teasing him and saying, "Oh, it must be easier now that you've made all this money on Les Mis." This was just after Miss Saigon had opened. They were saying, like, you don't have to worry about money. It must be so easy. And I remember him saying, "No, it's much harder now because I don't have to write. Like I could retire." And he also said, "So much of what fueled my writing," I'm quoting him, was anger at injustice and anger. The struggle. I don't have to struggle as much now. It makes it harder. So I guess the struggle is good.
When someone like him writes a musical on the very same topics that you want to write.
Oh yeah, that was unfortunate, wasn't it?
I mean, what are the odds?
I know! I remember talking to a friend of mine and saying, I'd written most of the House of Martin Guerre, and I thought, I think this is really good. I mean, I don't think anything could go wrong now, not unless Stephen Sondheim, Andrew Lloyd Webber, or Schoenberg and Boublil were writing the same story. And it happened. Nuts. And in a way, Cameron Mackintosh, who was the producer of Schoenberg and Boublil's musical, he kind of steered me in that direction because he suggested that I write a musical based on something by Pagnol. And I went looking for Pagnol films, Jean de Florette and the others, and right there was the House of Martin Guerre, or the Return of Martin Guerre was right beside them, and I got that one out too, and oh man.
Oh.
Yeah. Oh well, doesn't matter. It's still had lots of productions. And it's going to be at Stratford again in November.
And I guess it doesn't happen often.
No.
So.
Yeah. Well, no, it does.
It does?
Yeah. In fact, there's a Canadian team, Colin Dauncey and Kiva. They wrote a story about called I don't know what it's called now. It was called Prom Queen. Now it's being called something else, and I think it's being produced at Theatre Calgary. So they wrote this story about a gay guy that wanted to take his boyfriend to the prom, right when the New York, they developed Prom or whatever it was called.
Oh, right,
Yeah,
Prom.
exactly.
It just closed recently, last month.
Exactly the same time.
Oh.
Bad luck. So it actually does happen fairly frequently.
Wow, I didn't think about it until now.
Yeah, there are many. I remember talking to an artistic director, and he said that every year he gets musical versions of Cyrano de Bergerac and what's the Oscar Wilde, the painting in the attic.
Dorian Gray?
Yes, Dorian Gray. He said every year another version comes in, and so yeah, there are some topics that I think there are many Tale of Two Cities out there. I've seen 3 Cyrano de Bergeracs.
It's one of my favorite. I guess I read the play as a kid. I'm not sure why. Like I was probably like 11 years old, and I just was in the library and like I saw this book, and I was like, I never read something like poetic, I guess, like lyrical style, but I'm like, wow, it sounds interesting. And in the end I was crying, and I was like, what's happening?
Yeah, it's a brilliant play, which is why I've never thought of musicalizing it. How are you going to make it better?
Yeah, they made a movie recently, but it's not the same.
The original, there's an old movie. Oh God, who's in it? Oh God, I own it. I can't even remember who's in it. Oh, anyway, it's really good, but it's an old one, like 40s or something.
The new movie is about a writer as he writes this.
Oh.
Like he has his deadline, he has this writer's block for a long time. He hasn't written anything. And now he told someone that he is writing this play and he can produce it, but he has like to finish it like very fast.
Interesting.
So it's about his struggle.
What's it called?
I think Cyrano de Bergerac.
Oh, okay.
I'll send you a link because like I saw it like a couple of weeks ago and I was like, huh, interesting.
So it's in the movie theaters now?
No.
Oh, is it like
I don't even remember. Maybe I saw it on a plane or something. I don't remember.
Oh, okay.
But I didn't know much about the writer and I was like, huh, that's an interesting perspective on this story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like stuff like that, like French Lieutenant's Woman, and with the two parallel stories going on, and yeah.
I was wondering, back to songwriting, how do you block a song?
Like stage it in your mind?
Yeah, because you know when you like he stands and looks out the window, you know.
Yeah.
Like to be very specific.
I always try to give my characters something to do in the scene, so that they're not just standing there singing about their feelings. So there's an action, and I almost always have another person in the scene to whom they're singing, so they're not just singing to themselves. Again, this is avoiding the soliloquy songs. And if they have an action, and you know what's in the room, and what they're wearing, and what the temperature is, and what time of the day it is, if you know all these things, then your writing can become very specific. And I believe that makes a much stronger song than just a vague song about, gee, I miss my lover that just left, or I'm falling in love, and they're too general for me.
Do you have like arguments with the director, like no, I don't want him to look out the window or like something like that when she reads the book?
It depends on the director. Some are open to conversations with the writer, some aren't. I've been fortunate in that a lot of the directors I've worked with have been open to conversations. I don't argue because it's the director's job to block the show. I know it's not my territory, but I'm open to suggestions, to critiques of my writing from the director. If they're also, very often they say, what did you have in mind here? Or why did you write this line? Or I love that. And then we're totally on the same page, but no, you really have to test the temperature of the room with the director, because there are some directors that don't want you to say anything. Or they would love it if you would just stay away.
How do you find the balance between artistic integrity and commercial viability? I talked to several people, like lately to Paul Sportelli and Jay Torvey, and like I asked them, like, do you think, like, is it producible when you write the score, for example? Like, are there like too many musicians, or like will it be too expensive to produce in a small theater in Canada?
For the last little while, I've pretty much only been doing commissions. Like the Grand Theatre commissioned me. I was commissioned to do Martin Guerre. I was commissioned by Queen's, and usually they have stipulations. They can only afford a cast so big. They can only afford so many musicians. So usually they're imposed on me. I'm happy with restrictions. I have trouble when somebody comes to me and says, we'd like you to write us a musical. It can be anything, any size, anything you want. I don't even know where to start. But for instance, Queen's University, they said, well, we want it to have legs, which means they don't want it to be the history of a little village in Ontario. Like they want it to be something that has universal appeal. But they want more women than men in it. They want it because they have so many more girls or women in the Queen's University in the musical theatre course. So they want more women than men. That was the stipulation. It can be. They wanted a lot of people. They want a large cast because the two people who are interested in it, one is a commercial producer and the other is the university. So they want as many students in it as possible. So large cast, more women than men, and something that's not local, like it's something that's not of limited interest to a wide public. So I can run with that. Yeah.
Okay, I have another question.
Yeah.
You know, Canadian musicals know that if it's not too local, how can it be like, you know, Canadian and not like too close to American musicals in style? Because I know that now there are people making many new Canadian musicals, like original works. And I was wondering, like, is being too specific kind of an impediment? Like,
it's what you decide to be specific about. I think that there are. Let's use Fiddler on the Roof. That's very specific.
oh yeah.
But the themes are universal. I don't think there's anybody in the world who, well, unless you're a Nazi or something, I don't think there's anybody that's not moved by that story and what happens to those characters. I know I'm awash with tears by halfway through and don't stop crying till the end. I don't think you have to be a Russian Jew. I think it's dealing with something bigger than that. It's dealing with traditions, and generations, and losing your home, and like community, and it's so many themes, and they're absolutely universal. So I think, and I believe that the specificity, I think if they wrote that musical trying to think, well, we're not going to be specific because, you know, if you're not Jewish and living in Russia, you're not going to be able to, you know, be specific. I know, like when Arthur Miller wrote The Crucible, he wanted to write something about the McCarthy era. Well, he didn't write about he wrote something completely, and it's very specific, but it's a great big metaphor. So, and I think everybody can relate to it. I hope. So I think that's what we're looking for is Tennessee Williams. So much of what he wrote, if not everything, it was so localized. It was so southern states, but the themes are universal.
I was curious, you know, some musicals, like the target audience is mostly children, like Matilda, for example. I was wondering, like, do you think about target audience? Like, how does it inform your writing? If you write for children, for example, probably you don't, but...
Oh, no, I had my own theater for young audiences company for 20 years. It's how I made my living from 20 to 40. You have to keep in mind things like, depending on the age group that you're aiming for. If they're very young, you've got to keep it up tempo and the song's short and move. You can't dwell on things for too long. Their attention spans aren't that long.
So pacing is one of the main factors, I guess.
Pacing, yes, absolutely. Lots of physical comedy. There are lots of things that you keep in mind if you're writing for kids. I enjoy writing for kids. What I don't do is change my standards. I don't say, oh, well, it's for kids, so I don't have to rhyme properly. Oh, it's for kids, so it doesn't matter if they sing out of tune. Oh, it's just for kids. No, the bar is still set at the same level, but you just have to keep a few things in mind, like better have more up tempos than ballads, maybe no ballads at all, more humor. But a lot of people think that you have to be leaping around acting like an idiot the whole time. If they're if they're wrapped up in the story, you can sustain some touching moments, and you can have some short ballads, and you can explore some themes. We used to, when I had the theater for young audiences, the kids would write us letters, and the teachers would have them send us pictures. It was amazing what questions they would ask and what they noticed, and I mean they're quite profound.
Can you give me one example? What really surprised you?
Oh boy.
From their feedback?
It was a long time ago. They would notice. I might have a metaphor. Like I'll have the person singing about something, and it's a metaphor, and he really means to be saying something else. They got it every time. I did a Rumpelstiltskin. Rumpelstiltskin was one show that I did, and I actually gave a little song to Rumpelstiltskin about why. Like I wondered, why does he want this baby? He lives wild and free in the forest. Why does this guy want a baby? So I gave him a song about how lonely he was in the forest and how he had no friends, and it was a ballad, and it was about how he was mimicking the sounds of the forest and the wolves. Everything was lonely sounding, the wind, the wolves, all this stuff, and And the kids would write back, and they were all touched by Rumpelstiltskin's plight. And oh, okay, so he didn't end up getting the baby in the end, but is he still lonely in the forest? And like, that's not a happy ending. Because now there's something, you know, everybody would go, oh, the queen kept the baby, so that's a happy ending. They would write in and say, yeah, but she broke her word. She made a deal with him, and he spun the straw into gold, and then she went back on her word and tricked him, and now he's back lonely in the forest. And they would catch all those things. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And is there like humor different, like when you set up the punchline of a song?
Mm-hmm.
Like, is it different when you write for young, like, you know, for children?
Yes, there are more pies in the face and more pratfalls. Children, well, adults do too, but they love physical comedy. And the eye is drawn to movement, and if the characters are just standing still for a really long time, and you've got a very young audience, like 4 to 8-year-olds or whatever, you can't really have them just standing still and not doing anything for a really long time and coming up with witticisms. You kind of have to have them occasionally trip over something or run into something or something with movement and an energy, and you'll get them back.
It's almost one. Is there anything you would like to talk about?
No. I don't know what exactly the focus of your project is, so...
Well, I'm not sure who the target audience will be, because there are people who come to the archive, so it's in academia, but on the other side, I often share it on YouTube as well, and social media, like, you never know who will end up watching it, right?
Yeah. Well, I just think that it's a fabulous time for musical theatre in Canada. When I started out, really all the musicals were in New York, and everybody said if you want to get anywhere in musical theatre, you got to move to New York. And something's happening in Canada these days because of Michael Rubinoff at the Sheridan, the Canadian Musical Theatre Project at Sheridan College. That's been amazing. They workshop half a dozen shows every year. Come From Away came out of that program. Queen's University has now amalgamated the music department and the drama department, and they're putting them together and creating musicals. There's just something exciting is happening in Canada, and I feel that there's a new respect for the art form. I hope that's developing, and we're seeing more musicals now. I remember years ago, if you talked to the average person about musical theatre, they knew Les Mis and they knew Phantom of the Opera, but they didn't know many other. Like if you talk to a New Yorker, they know the Jason Robert Brown musicals, and they know the Michael John Cusas, and they know the Adam Gettles, but nobody knew any of these musicals up here. They just knew Cats and Mamma Mia. But I feel like that's changing too. So I have hope. I have great hope for musical theatre in Canada.
You know, I believe in serendipity. Like, do you have some example of, like, I guess, lucky circumstances? Like, for example, I managed to bump into Michael Rubinoff accidentally in London at theatre. And I was like, it was a dream of mine to meet this guy. And I was like, he just walks into this room, and I was like...
In London, England?
Yeah, at Phoenix Theatre.
Wow, that's amazing!
Well, it was like I'm from White Theatre, so it was like, but still I was like, what?
Yeah.
I did like a double take, like...
Yep. So much of that happens, and my piano teacher used to say, everyone gets the same number of opportunities, it's just that some people are ready for them and do something about them. Yeah.
And I guess the same happened to you with, Stephen Sondheim in a way.
Yeah, it was an accident. A friend gave Cameron McIntosh a demo of some of my songs, and I didn't even know that Stephen Sondheim was teaching at Oxford, and that they were looking for composer lyricists, and just luck.
And I was so touched by what you said about, the Sunday in the Park with George, that you were listening to that song, and how it all came together.
Yeah, really, it was very fluky. Yeah.
Anything else before we finish?
No, we should probably have lunch.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
You bet.